Most television shows produce a few moments of trouble across their long run. A bad joke, a controversial guest star, a moment that did not age well. The Simpsons has been making moments like that for nearly 4 decades, and the list just keeps growing. It has been threatened with a lawsuit by an entire country. It has had an episode quietly removed from one of the largest streaming services on Earth. It has been pulled from syndication after a national tragedy. It has been rebroadcast with edits because of a co-host in an SS uniform. It has been used as evidence in a foreign courtroom. It has quietly retired one of its longest-running characters in near silence. And it has predicted a presidency the writers later called a warning. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, this video walks slowly through the most controversial chapters in the show's long history, the people involved, the apologies that came late, and the scars that never fully healed. Welcome to Yellowfan. Let's get started. The Apu problem and the character that disappeared. In 1989, a new animated show landed on the Fox network and did something almost no other show on television was doing at the time. It put a working-class American family on the screen and let them be loud, broke, messy, and a little stupid. The Simpsons did not look like primetime television in the late 1980s. It did not sound like primetime television. And the people who created it were not really thinking about the next 35 years on the air. They were thinking about the next 20 episodes. That casual, almost reckless energy, that loose feeling of nothing being too precious to make a joke about, would become both the show's greatest gift and the source of nearly every problem the show would ever have. Because somewhere around the second season, the writers needed a quick character to fill a small role inside a convenience store, and that small role would turn into one of the most painful scandals the show would ever have to live with. The character was Apu Nahasapimapetalan, the Quickie Mart owner, the friendly clerk with the heavy accent, the catchphrase about coming again. He was not designed to be a stereotype. The writer Mike Reiss has gone on record about how the character was originally written in the script. The line in the margin literally said the words, "definitely not Indian," because the writers wanted to avoid the obvious cliché of an Indian convenience store clerk in American media. But then the table read happened. Hank Azaria, the voice actor who handled dozens of background characters on the show, was asked by a producer to try the line in a different voice. Azaria reached for an Indian accent that was heavy, exaggerated, and very much in the tradition of Peter Sellers in the 1968 film The Party, an old film in which a white actor in brownface played an Indian character for laughs. The room at the table read, "cracked up." The accent stuck. Apu was born. For a long time, nobody in the mainstream questioned it. Apu became a regular character. He showed up week after week. He was given an actual life on the show. He had a wife named Manjula. He had octuplets named Poonam and Sashi and Priya and Uma and Anoop and Sandeep and Nabendu and Geet. He had episodes built around him, like the one where he became an American citizen. He became a cultural shorthand for the friendly Indian shopkeeper everywhere in American media. Hank Azaria won Emmys for his voice work across the show. The line about thanking the customer and inviting them to come again became one of the most repeated phrases on the show. Across the country, kids who grew up on The Simpsons laughed at the character without thinking about him. And quietly, away from the writer's room, away from the network executives, away from the Emmy ballots, the character was also doing something else. The character was being used to bully real human beings. A young Indian-American comedian named Hari Kondabolu started talking about this in 2012. He was working as a writer on the FX show Totally Biased with W. Kamau Bell. In private conversations, he kept circling back to the Apu character. According to Kondabolu, Bell told him that if he did not write a stand-up bit about it for the show, he would be fired. The bit became famous. In it, Kondabolu describes Hank Azaria as a white guy doing an impression of a white guy making fun of his father. The clip spread online. The conversation began. And 5 years later, Kondabolu would go on to make an entire documentary about it called The Problem with Apu, released on True TV in November of 2017. The documentary was not an attack on the show. Kondabolu has said many times that he loved The Simpsons growing up. He has said the character of Apu was one of the only Indian voices he ever heard on American television as a kid. He was happy for any representation at all. But as he got older, the character started to feel different. The accent started to feel different. The way other kids at his school used the words about thanking the customer as a slur against him and his classmates started to feel different. His mother had told him once that you can criticize something you love because you expect more from it. That line stayed with him, and it shaped the whole tone of the documentary that he eventually made. The documentary collected interviews with South Asian American actors, comedians, and writers. People like Aziz Ansari, Kal Penn, Asif Manvi, Russell Peters, and Utkarsh Ambudkar. Each of them described moments from their childhood when the character had been thrown at them like a weapon. Kal Penn went the furthest. He said the character had ruined the show for him entirely. Utkarsh Ambudkar said something more measured but just as cutting. He said that the South Asian community in America had been so underrepresented for so long that one mainstream show with one mainstream Indian character could quietly tell mainstream America what an Indian person was supposed to be. Whoopi Goldberg, who has long collected racist memorabilia from American history, sat down with Kondabolu and told him plainly that she considered the Apu character to be a form of brownface, in the same tradition as the old blackface caricatures she had spent decades documenting. The documentary tried very hard to interview Hank Azaria. Azaria turned the interview down at the time. Kondabolu also tried to talk to Matt Groening. That meeting also did not happen. So Kondabolu did the documentary anyway, and it landed in late 2017, and it changed the conversation around the show forever. The Simpsons' response, when it came, was one of the more unfortunate moments in the show's modern history. In April of 2018, the writers aired an episode called No Good Read Goes Unpunished. In the episode, Marge is reading an old children's book to Lisa and realizes the book is full of outdated stereotypes. She starts editing the book on the fly to make it more acceptable, but the edited version is empty and lifeless. Lisa turns to the camera and breaks the fourth wall, asking the audience what someone is even supposed to do when something started decades ago and was applauded and inoffensive at the time becomes politically incorrect today. As Lisa says this, the camera slowly pans to her bedside table. Sitting there in plain sight, framed like a cousin or a beloved uncle, is a photo of Apu. The audience picked up the meaning of that scene instantly. It was not a defense of the character. It was an annoyed shrug at the people who had complained about him. The reaction online was not kind to the show. Critics called it tone-deaf. Kondabolu went on social media and said he was disappointed. He said the message of his entire documentary had been reduced down to the words, politically incorrect. The line from Matt Groening to USA Today around the same period, in which the show's creator suggested it was a time in the culture when people loved to pretend to be offended, did not help. And Mike Reiss did not help either. In his 2018 memoir, Springfield Confidential, Reiss called the documentary a nasty little piece of work, and suggested that the children taunting Indian kids about the character were not being racist, but simply being cruel in the way children can be. A long-running television empire had been handed a real opportunity to sit with a serious cultural critique. It had answered with a shrug, a fourth wall break, and a memoir. This was the moment when something shifted inside the cast itself. Hank Azaria, the man whose voice had carried the character for almost 30 years, was watching the same conversation everyone else was watching, and he was starting to think the conversation might be right. He has talked about the moment publicly many times since. He attended The Late Show with Stephen Colbert in April of 2018 and said on air that he would be perfectly willing to step aside from the role. He said the most important thing was to listen to Indian people about their actual experience of the character. That comment was the beginning of the end of Apu as a speaking character. In January of 2020, Azaria officially announced that he would no longer voice Apu. He has spent years since then talking about why. On the podcast Armchair Expert with Dak Shepard, he opened up about the slow journey he had taken from defensiveness to acceptance. He has talked about hate crimes in which South Asian shopkeepers were attacked and called Apu while it was happening. He has talked about a high school student who had never even seen the show, but who knew exactly what the word Apu meant when it was said in his direction. He has talked about how the character became a slur in American culture without anyone in the writer's room ever wanting that to happen. He has used phrases like participating in a harm. He has talked about apologizing to every single Indian person in America. He has even co-founded an anti-bias nonprofit aimed at educating people about media representation and credited his sobriety and 12-step recovery work for giving him the tools to actually own his part rather than defend it. Inside the show itself, the writers were left with a problem they could not solve cleanly. Recasting the character felt wrong. Writing him out felt cruel. Explaining his absence felt forced. So they did something quieter. They simply stopped giving him lines. Apu still appears visually in some episodes. Fans have spotted him in the background of crowd shots, behind the counter of the Quickie Mart, walking through Springfield, but he no longer speaks. The character has been silent for years. And every episode that he appears in without dialogue is a small reminder of the larger conversation the show was forced to have with itself. There was one more strange chapter in the middle of all of this. South Park noticed the documentary too. In 2018, South Park aired its own response episode called The Problem with Apu, in which their character, Mr. Hanky, is cancelled and exiled from his town. He is sent to a place where bigotry and hate are not taken seriously, which turns out to be Springfield, where Apu welcomes him in. The episode ended with a hashtag reading, "Cancel the Simpsons." Many viewers thought South Park was siding with Kondabalu. The truth turned out to be the opposite. Trey Parker and Matt Stone said in their commentary that the people on The Simpsons were friends, and that the episode was a jab at the documentary itself, not the show. Al Jean from The Simpsons agreed with that read. He said South Park's episode was actually in favor of the position that critics were being too harsh. And so a strange thing settled into place. A character created on a whim during a single table read in 1990 had ended up touching almost every part of the modern conversation about race, accent, casting, and American media. The character had been beloved. The character had been weaponized. The character had been defended and then quietly retired without ever being explained on screen. Inside the show, the silence around him is louder now than any line of dialogue ever was. And somewhere out there, in the long memory of television, the Quickie Mart still stands. The customers still walk in, and the man behind the counter no longer says a word. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Apu is the story of a character that quietly disappeared. The next story is about an entire episode that disappeared. One of the most famous celebrity guest spots in television history, recorded in secret, hidden behind a fake name, beloved for nearly 30 years, and and then erased from the catalog of one of the largest streaming services on Earth in a single day. The reason it was pulled was not a stereotype or a joke. It was a documentary that aired in 2019 and a single phone call between three of the most powerful men in animation. Section 2, the Michael Jackson episode that Disney erased. The early 1990s were a strange time for The Simpsons. The show had been on the air for 2 seasons and had become an enormous hit. Bart Simpson was on lunchboxes and t-shirts and bumper stickers. People who had never even seen the show could quote the catchphrases. The character was so popular that the President of the United States, George Bush, gave a public speech in which he said American families ought to behave more like the family from the Waltons and less like the family from The Simpsons. The writers responded the next week with a chalkboard line of their own. They were not afraid of pushback. They were not afraid of fame. And they were about to receive a phone call that would change the show in a way nobody on staff was prepared for. According to Nancy Cartwright, the voice actress who played Bart, the call came in at the producer's home one night. The voice on the other end of the line said it belonged to Michael Jackson. Jackson at that point was the biggest pop star alive. He had released Thriller and Bad. He was selling out stadiums on every continent. He was also a fan of Bart Simpson. He told the producer that he wanted to write Bart a #1 hit single, and that he wanted to guest star on the show in some way. The producer was understandably stunned. The conversation continued, and out of that one strange phone call, 2 pieces of Simpsons history were born. One of them was a song that would go on to top the charts in 7 countries. The other was an episode that would be loved for nearly 3 decades and then erased from the show's permanent record almost overnight. The episode aired on September 19, 1991, as the Season 3 premiere. It was called Stark Raving Dad. The setup was simple. Homer is doing laundry at home. Bart's lucky red hat ends up in the wash with all of Homer's white work shirts. The shirts come out pink. Homer wears a pink shirt to the nuclear power plant. A psychological evaluation form is going around the office. Homer fills it out absent-mindedly. The result lands him in a mental institution. There he meets his roommate, a tall, heavy-set white man with a soft voice who introduces himself with complete sincerity as Michael Jackson. Homer, who somehow has no idea who the real Michael Jackson is, believes him completely. The two strike up a friendship. The voice of the roommate, a man eventually revealed to be Leon Kompowski, a bricklayer from New Jersey, was provided by Michael Jackson himself. Jackson recorded his speaking parts uncredited because of his contract with Sony Music. The credits at the time of broadcast listed the role under the pseudonym John J. Smith. Almost nobody outside the production crew knew the truth. The singing voice in the episode was provided by an impersonator because Jackson's contract did not allow him to perform vocally for another label, but the spoken voice was the real Michael Jackson. The episode also featured an original song called Happy Birthday Lisa, which Jackson helped write as a gift for Bart to give his sister at the end of the story. The song would later be released on the Songs in the Key of Springfield album. It was, on every level, a strange and tender piece of television. A pop star at the height of his fame had quietly slipped onto a cartoon and given it one of its most emotionally resonant endings. There was one related project. Around the same time, the show released a tie-in album called The Simpsons Sing the Blues. On that album was a track called Do the Bartman. The track went to #1 in the United Kingdom and several other countries. For years, the credits listed the writer of the song as Brian Lauren, a friend and collaborator of Jackson's. James L. Brooks even issued a press release in late 1990 to apologize for any confusion and confirm that Lauren, not Jackson, was the writer. But Matt Groening contradicted that publicly years later. In a 1996 interview with the magazine Loaded, and again at an animation convention in 1998, Groening said openly that Jackson had co-written and co-produced the song, and that Jackson had insisted his own name be referenced in the lyrics. Brian Loren himself eventually came out publicly in 2015 while selling the song's publishing rights and stated that he had been the sole writer of the song and that Jackson had only contributed background vocals and the title. The story behind a single Simpsons tie-in song is still not fully agreed upon to this day, but the episode itself, Stark Raving Dad, was loved by almost everyone who ever watched it. For nearly 20 years, that love was not complicated. The episode aired in syndication. It appeared in fan polls and best of lists. Fox even rebroadcast it as a tribute on July 5, 2009, just over a week after Michael Jackson's sudden death on June 25th. The accompanying music video for Do the Bartman was aired on June 28, 2009, with a special tribute card. For a moment in 2009, The Simpsons' connection to Jackson was something like a memorial. Then came the year 2019. A documentary called Leaving Neverland premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January of that year and aired on HBO on March 3rd and March 4th. It was directed by Dan Reed. It centered on two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who described in detail what they said had happened to them as children when they had been close to Michael Jackson. The documentary was 4 hours long. It was watched by millions of people. The cultural reaction was immediate. Radio stations stopped playing Jackson's music. Streaming services pulled some of his content. The Jackson estate condemned the documentary and pointed to inconsistencies with prior testimony given under oath. But the conversation around the singer changed almost overnight, especially among people who had not paid close attention to the older allegations. Inside The Simpsons, 3 men sat down to discuss the episode: executive producer James L. Brooks, showrunner Al Jean, and the documentary's director Dan Reed. They agreed on what to do. The decision they reached was that Stark Raving Dad would be removed from rebroadcast. It would be removed from FXX and from the Simpsons World streaming site that had hosted every episode of the show online. It would be removed from any future physical media. The complete third season DVD, which had sold for years with the episode as its first installment, was reprinted from scratch with the episode removed entirely. The new version of the DVD opens with what had been the second episode, called Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington. There is no acknowledgement in the menu. The episode is simply gone. When Disney Plus launched in November of 2019, with the entire run of The Simpsons as one of its biggest selling points, fans noticed quickly. Every episode was there. Every episode except one. Stark Raving Dad was missing. Season 3 started with episode 2. To this day, that gap remains. Of the more than 750 episodes of The Simpsons, only one cannot be found on the service that owns the rights to all of them. Al Jean has spoken about why publicly. In an interview with the Daily Beast around the time of the decision, Jean said something that has stayed with people. He said that on reflection, he believed Jackson's appearance on the episode might have been part of how the singer used celebrity to access children. He said he believed the cameo was something Jackson used in his grooming process. James L. Brooks has acknowledged in interviews that the decision had echoes of book burning. Dan Reed has said the same. None of them seemed comfortable with the act itself, but all 3 agreed that they could not, in good conscience, let the episode keep airing. The fan reaction was split. Some viewers, especially loyal Michael Jackson fans, were furious. They saw the episode as one of the great moments in cartoon history, and one of the few times the singer ever appeared in an animated role. Some canceled their Disney Plus subscriptions in protest. Others argued the show was attempting to erase a part of its own history, the way old films and books had been erased before. Still others supported the move. They said the episode could not be watched the same way after leaving Neverland. They said that letting children stumble across the episode without context was its own kind of harm. The conversation has never fully settled. The episode itself still exists, of course. It is still on old DVDs that were printed before the recall. It is still on hard drives and old VCR tapes. It can still be watched if a person searches in the right places. But officially, in the catalog of every legal place to watch the show, the episode does not exist anymore. It is the only one. Of every problematic Simpsons moment, of every offensive joke, of every controversial guest star across the show's enormous history, the only one that has been judged unwatchable enough to be removed is the one that featured the King of Pop, recorded under a fake name in a soft and gentle performance about a heavy-set man who believed he was someone he was not. There is a strange final layer to all of this. Hank Azaria, whose voice played a small part in that same episode, said in later interviews that the episode had aged into something he himself could no longer enjoy. He said he understood why it had to go. James L. Brooks, who had pushed hardest to make the show emotionally serious from the very beginning, was now the same man who had to push the button on one of the show's most emotionally serious episodes ever produced. The episode that had once been a quiet tribute had become a quiet wound, and it now sits alone outside the collection. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Apu story was about a character that disappeared in silence. The Michael Jackson story was about an episode that was deleted in protest. The next story is about something even larger than that, an entire country with the most powerful government in Asia looking at one episode of the show and quietly making sure that the people inside its borders never saw it. The episode involved a tank, a plaque, and a joke that the Chinese government did not find funny at all. Section 3. The Tiananmen joke that got the episode banned. By the year 2005, The Simpsons was already an institution. The show had been on the air for 16 years. It had outlasted most of the cartoons that had launched alongside it. It had outlasted most of the live-action sitcoms of its own era. It had become a kind of background hum to American culture. Every Sunday night, a new episode aired on Fox. Most weeks, the writers reached for whatever cultural moment was sitting in front of them and found a way to put the family into the middle of it. Selma Bouvier, Marge's older twin sister, the one with the deep, raspy voice and the long career at the DMV, had been a part of the show since the very first season. She had been married more than once. She had adopted a baby in an earlier episode, and in season 16, the writers decided to send her on another adoption journey, this time to a country that the show had never visited before. The country was China. The episode was called Goo Goo Gai Pan. The writer was Dana Gould. The director was Lance Kramer. It first aired on the Fox network on March 13, 2005. The plot itself was a soft sitcom setup, the kind of thing the show had built its reputation on. While giving Mr. Burns a driving test, Selma experiences a hot flash and learns from a doctor that she has entered menopause. The news shakes her. She wants a child of her own, and she now realizes she may not be able to have one. She turns to adoption. After a failed first attempt with one of the many children of Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel, Lisa suggests that Selma try China. Selma fills out the forms and is told that only married couples are eligible to adopt. She lists Homer as her husband on the paperwork. The Simpson family then flies to Beijing to help her complete the adoption. On the trip, the family begins running into the version of China that Western television had been quietly making jokes about for decades. They visit the mausoleum where the body of the founding leader Mao Zedong is preserved. Homer looks at the body and says the line that would later make headlines around the world. He calls Mao a little angel that killed 50 million people. The number is a reference to the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward campaign that Mao led between 1958 and 1962. Estimates of the death toll from that famine vary widely, ranging from several million to tens of millions. The line was a joke, but the joke was rooted in real history. The family also walks across Tiananmen Square. As they do, the camera lingers on a small commemorative plaque set into the ground. The plaque is written in plain English. It says that on this site, in 1989, nothing happened. The joke is the kind of dry joke the show had been pulling off for years. It does not raise its voice. It does not stop the action. It just sits there in the corner of the frame and waits for the audience to read it. The line refers to the Tiananmen Square crackdown of June 4th, 1989, in which Chinese government forces moved into the square in central Beijing and ended weeks of student-led pro-democracy demonstrations. The exact death toll has never been confirmed by the Chinese government. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. The Chinese state has spent decades since then working to remove all references to the event from inside the country. Public discussion of the date is restricted. Searches for the year are filtered. Even the candle emoji has been blocked on Chinese social media around the anniversary in some years. The joke on the plaque, that nothing happened, is a direct reference to that erasure. There is one more layer in the episode that almost slipped past most viewers. While the family is inside the Chinese consulate in Springfield earlier in the episode, a map of China is hanging on the wall. On that map, the island of Taiwan is shown as a separate country, colored differently from the Chinese mainland. The Chinese government has spent decades insisting that Taiwan is a province of China and not a separate nation. Many international companies have been forced to apologize for showing the map in the way the Simpsons writers showed it. The map was on screen for only a few seconds. Most viewers did not even notice it. The Chinese state did notice. And then there was the climactic moment of the adoption story itself. The adoption agent, a woman named Madame Wu, voiced by guest star Lucy Liu, finds out that Homer is not actually Selma's husband. She comes after the family in a Type 59 tank. The shot is staged in a direct visual reference to the famous photograph of an unknown protester standing in front of a column of tanks rolling out of Tiananmen Square in June of 1989. That photograph is one of the most banned images on the Chinese internet. The episode put a cartoon version of it in front of millions of viewers in prime time on a Sunday night in America. The Simpsons aired the episode and moved on. China did not. The episode was banned in the country in 2006, the year after it aired in the United States. That ban came as part of a wider regulation in which the Chinese government banned all foreign cartoons from airing in popular daytime viewing slots that were aimed at children. The new policy gave the government an easy way to keep the episode out of the country without having to explain exactly what was wrong with it. Inside China, the episode simply did not exist on television. For the next 15 years, it stayed that way. The episode lived on American DVDs. It lived in syndication. It lived on websites outside Chinese borders. Inside the country, it was simply absent. Most Chinese viewers never knew the episode had ever been made. Then came November of 2021. Disney Plus, the streaming service owned by the Walt Disney Company, launched in Hong Kong on November 16th of that year. The arrival of the service was a significant moment in the region. Disney Plus had already launched in many countries by that point. It had not yet launched in mainland China, and it never has, because the platform is blocked there, alongside most major American streaming services. But it was now available in Hong Kong, a city that had operated for decades under a separate set of rules from the mainland. Hong Kong had its own legal system, its own press, its own freedom of speech protections, and for many years, its own annual candlelight vigil to remember the Tiananmen Square crackdown. The vigil drew tens of thousands of people every June 4th. Books about the event could be bought in Hong Kong shops. Films about it could be screened. A small museum dedicated to the memory of the crackdown operated in the city for years. That had begun to change in 2020. The Chinese central government passed a national security law that summer that gave Beijing far more direct authority over Hong Kong. The annual vigil was banned, with the local government citing the pandemic as the reason. The museum was shut down. The university monument honoring the dead was eventually removed. A film censorship law passed in October of 2021 gave the Hong Kong government the power to ban films deemed threats to national security, even films that had previously been approved. By the time Disney Plus launched in Hong Kong in November of 2021, the climate had changed entirely. The freedoms that had let the city remember the events of 1989 were collapsing. It did not take long for Hong Kong viewers to notice something missing on the new service. The full run of The Simpsons was supposed to be available on the platform. Every episode, every season. But when subscribers in Hong Kong navigated to season 16, the catalog skipped from episode 11 directly to episode 13. Episode 12 was not there. The slot for Goo Goo Gai Pan was simply blank. There was no notice, there was no error message. The episode had been quietly removed from the regional version of the service. It was first reported by the local outlet Stand News on November 27, 2021. Within days, the story had spread internationally. Hong Kong Free Press confirmed the omission. Vice and the New York Times wrote about it. The Hong Kong Office of the Communications Authority, which regulates broadcasting in the city, declined to comment. Disney itself initially declined to give a public reason for the removal. Viewers who used a virtual private network to access the service from outside Hong Kong reported that the episode appeared normally for them. The block was specific to the region. The implication of the move was hard to miss. A streaming service owned by an American company was operating inside a city under tightening Chinese state control, and that streaming service had quietly removed an episode of an American cartoon because the episode contained jokes about an event that the Chinese state insists did not happen. There was no public outcry inside Hong Kong about the episode. There were no protests. There were no government letters demanding the removal. The episode simply disappeared from the catalog the moment the service launched. The decision had been made before any subscriber ever looked for it. Whether the decision was made by the Hong Kong authorities, by Disney itself in anticipation of the local laws, or by some quiet conversation between the two, the public has never been told. Disney was already navigating similar issues elsewhere. A few months earlier, the company had released the Marvel film Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Sharp-eyed viewers noticed a small detail in one scene. A bus driver wore a sleeve with the numbers 8964 printed on it. Read in a particular order, those numbers point to the date of the Tiananmen crackdown, the 4th of June, 1989. Some viewers believe the prop department had inserted the reference deliberately. Whether or not it was intentional, the company had a pattern of being caught up in moments where its content brushed against the most sensitive topic in modern Chinese politics. The Simpsons removal in Hong Kong fit that pattern. The episode itself, Goo Goo Gai Pan, is not particularly well loved among fans. Reviews of the episode at the time of its original 2005 broadcast were mixed. Critics called it erratic. They said the comedy did not really come from the unlikely pairing of Homer and Selma, but from a string of broad jokes about Chinese culture. The voice work by Lucy Liu was praised. The plot was not. By the standards of the show in season 16, it is a middle-of-the-road episode. Few people would put it on a list of the show's best work, and yet it is now, alongside Stark Raving Dad, one of the most famous removed episodes in the history of the show. Not because it was good, because of what it dared to put on the screen. There is a final detail that makes the whole story sit in a strange light. The plaque inside the cartoon, the one that reads that nothing happened in 1989, 1989 is not just a joke. It is a perfect, compressed description of what the Chinese state has spent over 30 years trying to make true. The state cannot change the past. It can only try to remove every record of it. The Simpsons, in 22 minutes of Sunday night television in 2005, encoded the entire effort into a single sight gag. 16 years later, a global media corporation removed the episode from the catalog of the very city that had once been the last place inside Chinese borders where the truth could be remembered. The plaque had become real life. The episode had become exactly what it was joking about. Disney has never released a formal statement explaining the removal. The episode is still missing from Disney Plus in Hong Kong as of the most recent reports. Inside mainland China, of course, the episode was already long gone. The official Chinese position remains that the events of June 4th, 1989 did not happen in the way the rest of the world remembers them. The official Disney position on Gugugaipan is silence. And somewhere on a server in Hong Kong, the slot where the episode used to live still skips from 11 to 13, and nothing fills the space in between. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Gugugaipan is the story of a single cartoon being quietly erased by a state with the power to do it. The next story is the story of a different country reacting in the opposite way, loud and angry and pointing toward a courtroom. The country was Brazil. The episode was set in Rio de Janeiro. The tourism board, the president of the country, and an enormous public outcry came down on the show all at the same time. The writers, instead of apologizing once and moving on, made the same joke again and again and again for years. Section 4. When Brazil almost sued The Simpsons. The 13th season of The Simpsons aired in the late autumn and early spring of the years 2001 and 2002. By then, the show had been on the air for over a decade. The writers were deep into a phase that fans would later refer to as the post-Golden Era. The episode still had the family at the center, but the structure of the show had shifted. Storylines now leaned more heavily on travel. The Simpson family had already been to Australia. They had been to Japan. They had been to Africa. They had been to Britain. The family vacation episode had become a recurring engine for the writers. Drop the family into a foreign country, let the city or the culture become the punchline, and let Homer cause an international incident. That was the formula. By the spring of 2002, the writers had run through a long list of possible destinations and were looking for somewhere new to go. They settled on Brazil. The episode was written by Bob Benditson. The director was Stephen Dean Moore. It was the 15th episode of the 13th season. The title was Blame It on Lisa, a play on the title of the 1984 film Blame It on Rio. It first aired on the Fox network on March 31st, 2002. Roughly 11 million American viewers watched it on the night of broadcast. It was not promoted in any unusual way. There was no expectation that this particular episode would cause a problem outside the country. The travel episodes often took mild liberties with the cultures they visited. The Australian episode had taken plenty of liberties. The Japanese episode had taken even more. Most of the time, the affected country shrugged and laughed and moved on. Brazil did not shrug. Brazil sent the show toward a courtroom. The plot of Blame It on Lisa was, by the standards of the show, a fairly standard travel setup. Marge discovers that the family has run up a $400 phone bill due to repeated calls to Brazil. Lisa eventually admits the calls are hers. She has been sponsoring an orphan boy named Ronaldo. The monthly letters had stopped arriving. Lisa called the orphanage to find out why and was told the boy had gone missing. The Simpson family then flies to Rio de Janeiro to find him. From the moment they land in the city, the episode unloads what would later be called every available stereotype of Brazil and Latin America. The streets of Rio are filled with monkeys swinging from buildings. Rats run through the favelas in coordinated formations like soldiers. Children gather around the tourists and pick their pockets. A taxi driver kidnaps Homer and drives him deep into the Amazon rainforest, holding him for ransom. Bart watches a children's television show called Teleboobies, in which the on-screen hosts dance suggestively in front of a young audience, a parody of the real Brazilian children's host, Xuxa. The carnival floats roll through the city, covered in dancers performing routines that are far too explicit for the implied family audience. A snake swallows Bart whole on Copacabana Beach. The episode was, by almost any standard, an unflattering portrait of an entire nation. Even by Simpsons travel episode standards, it was sharp. The earlier Australian episode had at least leaned on the idea that Australia was a fellow English-speaking country with a similar sense of humor. The Brazilian episode did not have that fallback. The jokes felt, to many viewers, less like satire of a peer culture and more like a long string of stereotypes assembled by people who had never actually visited the country. Lisa was even shown explaining to Bart on the plane ride down that people in Brazil speak Portuguese and not Spanish. Bart, who had been studying Spanish in preparation, becomes frustrated. The line implied that the writers themselves had only just remembered that distinction. The show treated the entire continent as roughly interchangeable. The reaction in Brazil was almost immediate. Rio Tour, the official tourism board of Rio de Janeiro, watched the episode and was furious. The board was, at that exact moment in 2002, in the middle of a multi-year, multi-million-dollar campaign to attract more international tourists to the city. The campaign had been running since 1999. It was about to enter what Rio Tour expected to be its peak years. They believed an episode of one of the most watched television shows on the planet, one that depicted the city as a war zone full of criminals and disease-carrying animals, could undo years of work. They went public almost as quickly as the criticism inside the country built up. The board's president at the time was a man named José Eduardo Ginley. He spoke to the press. He told reporters that the board was exploring legal action against Fox. He was not joking. He had instructed the legal team at Riotour to look into what could be done. The board prepared a complaint. The Brazilian government threw its weight behind the effort. The country's then president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, made a public statement of his own. He said the episode brought a distorted vision of Brazilian reality to the world. The combination of an angry tourism board, a national president, and a wave of public outrage inside the country put real pressure on the show. A single Sunday night cartoon had created a small diplomatic incident. The Simpsons did not handle the situation gracefully at first. James L. Brooks, the executive producer who had been with the show since the very beginning, issued a public statement. The first part of it was a real apology. Brooks said the show wished to apologize to the lovely city and people of Rio de Janeiro. The second part of it was a joke. Brooks added that if the apology did not settle the issue, Homer Simpson was offering to take on the president of Brazil on the network's celebrity boxing show. The line was clearly meant to diffuse the situation with humor. Inside the show's writing room, it probably read as harmless. Inside Brazil, in the middle of an active legal investigation, it read as a second insult layered on top of the first one. The board did not laugh. The lawsuit eventually went nowhere. American parody law, particularly the protections offered under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, made it almost impossible for a foreign tourism board to win damages against an American satirical television show. The Riotour legal team studied the situation and eventually decided not to file. President Cardoso let his statement stand and moved on. Ginley himself, the head of the tourism board, gave a few more interviews and then let the matter rest. Inside the Country, the episode aired in December of 2002, with a written statement at the very beginning informing viewers that Fox was not responsible for the vision of the producers behind the episode. That kind of disclaimer is rare. It almost never appears on imported American television shows. The Brazilian broadcast version was the only time the disclaimer was attached. The board spokesman, a man named Sergio Cavalcanti, gave an interview to Reuters around the time of the controversy. He was asked which specific element of the episode had been the most offensive. His answer was unexpected. He said the deepest cut had been the monkeys. He said the idea that Rio de Janeiro was a jungle, with monkeys swinging through the streets like the city was untamed wilderness, had bothered the board more than the kidnapping or the muggings or the dancers. The image of the monkeys, he said, was the image that would stay with people. Most American writers, hearing that, would have quietly noted it and moved on. The Simpsons writing staff did the opposite. They turned the criticism into a recurring joke. 2 seasons later, in the episode The Regina Monologues from season 15, Homer makes an offhand reference to the monkey problem getting worse in Rio. The line is a callback meant only for the audience that had been following the controversy. It is delivered in passing. Most viewers did not catch it. The viewers who had been part of the original argument caught it instantly. In the next season, in the episode Mr. Spritz Goes to Washington, Krusty the Clown reveals that immigration officials are constantly hounding him because his sidekick monkey, Mr. Teeny, is from Brazil. Krusty adds that Mr. Teeny's uncle was the head monkey on the Bureau of Tourism. The joke is more direct. It is aimed straight at Rioter. The board did not respond. By that point, the moment had passed. The show moved on. The monkey gag stayed in the script. The controversy reshaped how the show approached travel episodes. For a long time, the Brazilian incident was used inside the writing room as a benchmark. Showrunner Al Jean has said in interviews that every other country the show had visited had taken the jokes in good humor. Brazil, he said, had caught the staff by surprise. The writers had not expected a tourism board to threaten legal action. They had not expected a head of state to issue a statement. The episode had not been designed as anything more than another travel installment. It became, instead, the moment when the show realized that its global audience could fight back. The episode itself fell into a kind of permanent shadow. It was not banned. It is still part of the season 13 DVD release. It is still on streaming services, but it is not aired often in syndication. Most channels skip over it. When the Simpson family eventually returned to Brazil in season 25, in an episode about the World Cup called You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee, the writers worked hard to balance the comedy. The episode still made jokes about football and about Brazilian culture, but it also included direct shots of the city's beauty. It showed Rio de Janeiro as a real place, rather than a cartoon battlefield. The writers had, in their own way, learned the lesson. In the longer history of the show, Blame It on Lisa marks a quiet turning point. It is one of the episodes that sits at the boundary between the Simpsons of the late 1990s and the Simpsons of the early 2000s. The earlier travel episodes had been built on the assumption that the audience would understand the satire. The Brazilian episode was the first one to discover, in real time, that the audience now included entire nations who had no patience left for the joke. The show had grown larger than the writing room. It had reached audiences who could organize, push back, and invite the United States Embassy in Brasilia to take the call. After that, the writers were never quite as casual about throwing the family into a country they had not researched. Years later, the episode is still cited in journalism classes and media studies discussions as an example of how a global show in the early streaming era can stumble into an international incident without ever meaning to. It is also cited as the moment when The Simpsons learned what its own reach actually meant. There is one more legacy. The episode contains a single line, near the end, in which one of the kidnappers tells Homer that the Amazon rainforest is being burned down, and that he ought to enjoy the view while he still can. In 2002, that line was throwaway. In 2019, when fires across the Amazon dominated international news, that same line aged in a way the writers could not have predicted. The episode that had once offended a country with its monkeys and its rats became, almost 2 decades later, an unintentional preview of a real environmental crisis. The cartoon kept catching up to the world kept catching up to the cartoon. And the monkeys, the ones that had bothered Sergio Cavalcanti more than anything else, became one of the longest-running inside jokes in the show's history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Brazilian story is the story of a country that fought back, loudly, with lawyers, with a president, and with a tourism board ready to file in court. The next story is about a country that fought back even louder, with letters, with parliamentary debate, and with a national sense of humor that finally ran out. The country was Australia. The episode involved a prank phone call, an oversized boot, an embassy standoff, a moon-faced Bart with a patriotic message written across his rear, and a piece of dialogue that more than 100 people sat down and wrote angry letters about. Section 5. The Australian Diplomatic Incident. In the middle of the 1990s, when The Simpsons was at the very peak of its creative powers, the writers had a habit of sitting around the room and asking each other where the family should go next. The travel episode was a tool the show used carefully. It was not used every season. When it was used, the writers would pick a country and study it just long enough to assemble a comedic portrait of the place. The portrait was rarely respectful. It was rarely careful. It was usually written in a few weeks by a small team of American writers who had never lived in the country they were sending the family to. By season 6, in the year 1995, the writers had decided it was time to send Bart and the rest of the family to Australia. The episode was called Bart vs. Australia. The writers were Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the two showrunners who would later become responsible for some of the most beloved episodes of the entire show. The director was Wes Archer. The episode first aired on the Fox network in the United States on February 19, 1995. The setup of the episode was almost impossibly silly. Bart and Lisa are arguing in the bathroom about how water drains in different parts of the world. Lisa, who has read about it in a book somewhere, tries to explain something called the Coriolis effect. She tells Bart that water drains counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. The science she describes is, in the real world, mostly a myth. The Coriolis effect does influence very large-scale systems like hurricanes and ocean currents, but the amount of water in a sink or a toilet is far too small to be meaningfully affected by it. The writers use the popular myth as a story engine anyway. Bart refuses to believe Lisa and decides to test the claim by making international phone calls to people in countries south of the equator. He calls Antarctica. He calls a fictional South American dictatorship. He calls an island in the South Pacific that is actively erupting. None of his calls produce a clean answer. Eventually, he calls a young Australian boy named Tobias Drundridge, who lives on a remote farm with his father Bruno. Bart pretends to be Dr. Bart Simpson of the International Drainage Commission in Springfield. He keeps Tobias on the phone for hours. The line stays open. The phone bill at the Drundridge farm climbs to $900 Australian dollars. When the bill arrives, Bruno Drundridge is not amused. He calls Bart back. Bart mocks him on the phone. Bruno is furious, but the situation only escalates because of where Bruno happens to live. His next-door neighbor is a member of the Australian Parliament. The neighbor reports the incident directly to the office of the Prime Minister of Australia. The Australian government decides that this American boy has committed an act of fraud against an Australian citizen, and they begin sending letters demanding payment. Bart ignores the letters. He throws them into his wastebasket. Lisa eventually finds them. The fraud case escalates. Bart is officially indicted by the government of Australia. A representative of the United States State Department, a fictional bureaucrat named Evan Conover, voiced by the late Phil Hartman, comes to the Simpson family home. Conover explains that Bart's prank has become a serious diplomatic problem. Relations between the United States and Australia are already tense, and the government would like to imprison Bart for 5 years to placate the Australian state. Marge refuses. Conover offers a softer alternative. The family will fly to Australia. Bart will deliver a public apology in front of the Australian Parliament. The charges will be dropped. The family agrees and flies down. What happens once the family arrives in Australia is where the episode becomes truly strange. The family stays at the United States Embassy in Canberra. Bart is told that his apology will not be the end of the punishment. Australian tradition, as Conover explains it, requires an additional consequence. The consequence is a procedure called a booting. A booting, in the world of the episode, is the act of being kicked in the rear with an oversized boot. The boot is enormous. It is the size of a small car. It is wielded by a member of the Australian government. The Australian flag, in the world of the episode, contains an image of a boot kicking a rear end as one of its design elements. Homer is horrified. He shouts about how only a sick country would do something like that. Conover quickly hushes him and warns him that disparaging the boot is itself a bootable offense. The line is one of the most quoted in the episode. It is also the line that became the signature image of the entire controversy. The plot of The Booting is a parody of a real-world story that had been in the news the year before the episode aired. In 1994, an American teenager named Michael Fay had been arrested in Singapore for vandalizing cars with spray paint. Singaporean law allowed for the use of caning as a corporal punishment. Fay was sentenced to be caned. The case became a major international incident. The American media argued back and forth about whether caning was barbaric or whether it was a reasonable punishment for vandalism. President Bill Clinton publicly asked the Singaporean government to reconsider. Sentence was reduced from 6 strokes to 4, but the caning still went forward. The story dominated the news cycle. The Simpsons writers took the entire situation, lifted it whole, replaced Singapore with Australia, replaced caning with booting, and turned it into a half hour of television. What follows in the episode is a series of escalations. Bart is told to apologize. He arrives at the Australian Parliament and delivers a flat reading of his prepared remarks. The Parliament accepts the apology and then asks him to step forward for the booting. Homer steps in to stop it. He grabs the boot. He puts it on his own foot. He threatens to boot the Prime Minister of Australia in return. The family flees through a window of the Parliament building and is chased through the streets of Canberra by an angry mob, including Bruno Drundridge himself. The family makes it back to the embassy. The two governments negotiate. They agree to a compromise. Bart will accept a single boot through the embassy gate with a regular shoe rather than the oversized one. The Prime Minister of Australia will deliver the kick himself. The shoe will be a wingtip. Bart agrees. He approaches the gate. The Prime Minister readies his foot, and at the last possible second, Bart drops his pants, dodges the kick, and presents to the assembled Australians a rear end on which someone has written the patriotic American phrase, "Don't tread on me." He hums the Star-Spangled Banner while he does it. The Australians explode in fury. The mob storms the embassy. The Simpson family is evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof in a visual reference to the famous photograph of the American evacuation of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. They are taken to a U.S. Navy laundry ship called the USS Walter Mondale, named after the former vice president who had lost the 1984 presidential election in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. The ship is a laundry ship because in the world of the episode, Mondale was such an unimpressive political figure that the only naval vessel ever named after him handled laundry. The episode ends with one final visual joke. Bart's pet bullfrog, which he had been forced to leave at the Australian airport upon arrival because of laws against bringing invasive species into the country, has escaped its container. The frog has been adopted by a kangaroo and slipped into the country. The frog has reproduced. By the end of the episode, the descendants of Bart's single bullfrog are spreading across the Australian countryside, eating crops, multiplying out of control, and devastating local farms. The image is a direct reference to a real ecological crisis in Australia involving cane toads, which had been brought into the country in the 1930s to control beetle populations and had since become a destructive invasive species. The Simpson family, watching from the helicopter, laughs at the chaos they have caused. None of them notice that a koala has snuck onto the helicopter alongside them. The implication is that the cycle is about to repeat in reverse, with American ecology now under threat from an Australian invader. The episode aired in the United States and got a strong reception. Critics praised it. Fans loved it. It was nominated for an Emmy in 1995 in the category for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Sound Mixing. Inside the writing room, the episode was considered a success. The reaction in Australia was a different story. Within days of the episode airing, the writing staff began receiving letters. The letters came directly from Australian viewers. By the time the wave was finished, the staff had received more than 100 angry letters from Australians who said the episode was an insult to their country. The letters complained about the depiction of the Prime Minister as a casual figure who lounged around in a small backyard pool. They complained about the depiction of the Australian Parliament as a chaotic, dirty, beer-soaked room. They complained about the running joke that Australian ecosystems were filled with strange and aggressive animals. They also complained about something more specific. They complained about the accents. The voices the American animators had used for the Australian characters did not sound Australian to actual Australians. The letters consistently said the accents in the episode sounded more like South African accents. That detail became one of the most cited complaints in the entire wave of correspondence. The Simpsons writer and producer Mike Reiss has spoken openly about the reaction in interviews over the years. He has said that the Australian episode is the least favorite Simpsons episode in Australia. He has said that whenever the Simpson family visits another country, that country tends to react with anger, and Australia was no exception. He has gone further than that. According to Reiss, the episode was condemned in the Australian Parliament after it aired. Members of Parliament discussed the episode on the floor of the chamber. The exact transcript of those discussions is harder to track down, but the fact of the discussion has been confirmed by multiple Simpsons staff members in interviews over the decades. A cartoon episode about a fake country with a fake boot had become a topic of debate in a real legislative body on the other side of the world. The interesting twist in the long aftermath of the episode is what Australia eventually did with it. By the year 1999, just 4 years after the episode aired, Fox Studios Australia had opened a Simpsons-themed attraction in Sydney called The Simpsons Down Under. The centerpiece of the attraction was a re-edited version of Bart vs. Australia. The studio reached out to the Simpsons writing staff and asked them to write new scenes for the ride. The staff agreed. New animation was produced. The ride used motion capture technology to scan the faces of the visitors and turn them into Simpsons characters inside the experience. The country that had been so angry about the episode in 1995 had, by 1999, turned the same episode into a paid tourist attraction. The shift from outrage to embrace happened in less than half a decade. The episode also gave the show one of its most repeated single jokes. The line in which an Australian man pulls out a small spoon, holds it up, and declares it a knife only for Bart to correct him and identify it as a spoon, has become one of the most quoted Simpsons moments of all time. The reference is to a famous scene from the 1986 Australian film Crocodile Dundee. The line was written into the Simpsons episode as a parody. It has since been quoted, copied, parodied, and referenced in countless places. Most people who quote it have no memory of where it originally came from. They simply know the rhythm of the dialogue. The episode that had once been formally condemned by the Australian Parliament had become so ingrained in the global culture that its smallest jokes had escaped the episode entirely and traveled around the world on their own. The Bart vs. Australia episode was followed by other travel episodes that learned from its mistakes. The writers became slightly more careful. They put more research into the countries the family visited. They tried, with mixed success, to find ways to mock a country that did not feel like a one-sided attack. The Brazilian episode that came years later was the case study in what happens when those lessons are forgotten. The Australian episode remains the case study in what happens when the lesson works out anyway. Australia got angry. Australia wrote letters. Australia debated the episode in Parliament. And then Australia built a theme park ride out of it. The whole arc, from outrage to embrace, is one of the strangest legacies of any single Simpsons episode ever produced. And somewhere, in a Canberra government building that is not at all the building shown in the cartoon, the Prime Minister of Australia continues to perform the duties of the office without ever once being required to wield an oversized boot against a visiting American child. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Australian episode is the story of a country that argued back and eventually made peace. The next story is about an episode that did nothing wrong when it aired, was loved at the time, won awards for its musical sequences, and then was quietly removed from the airwaves 4 years later by an event the writers could not have foreseen. The episode was set inside two specific buildings in Manhattan. Those two buildings were the World Trade Center, and after September of 2001, the entire episode would have to be edited, rewritten, and slowly returned to syndication with several pieces missing. Section 6. The 9/11 Problem. In the middle of the 1990s, the writers and producers of The Simpsons were preparing the show's 9th season. By that point, the show had been on the air for almost a decade. The creative team that had built the show during its golden era was beginning to think about what kinds of stories they had not yet told. One of the writers, a man named Ian Maxtone Graham, was a former resident of New York City. He had been pitching a New York episode for some time. He believed there was a particular kind of comedy that came from putting an out-of-town family into the chaos of Manhattan. He believed it was a classic Manhattan problem. He wanted Homer to lose his car somewhere in the city and to spend an entire episode trying to retrieve it. The writer's room agreed to the idea. The next question was where, exactly, in New York the car should be stranded. The two showrunners at the time, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, both had personal connections to one specific part of the city. Oakley had visited the World Trade Center in 1973, the year that construction on the Twin Towers was completed. He remembered standing in the open plaza between the two enormous buildings. He remembered the strange, vast emptiness of the space. He remembered the way the towers loomed overhead. He suggested that the car should be stranded in that very plaza, the open public square at the base of the buildings, officially known as the Austin J. Tobin Plaza. Weinstein agreed. He pointed out that the plaza was a perfect comic location. It was instantly recognizable to viewers around the world. It was a famous landmark. It was also a piece of architecture that almost no narrative show had ever bothered to use as a setting. The team agreed. The plaza became the center of the episode. The episode was called The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson. It was the first episode of the 9th season. It first aired on the Fox network in the United States on September 21st, 1997. Massive amounts of work went into making the New York setting feel real. The show's animation supervisor, David Silverman, was sent to Manhattan with a camera. He took hundreds of photographs of the city. He photographed the plaza, the buildings, the streets, and the surrounding neighborhoods. The film was developed at a drugstore, since this was the era before digital photography. The animators used the photographs as direct references. Background buildings were modeled from the actual skyline. The Tobin Plaza was reproduced in detail. The Twin Towers themselves appeared in roughly the same proportions and the same colors as their real counterparts. The plot itself begins at Moe's Tavern in Springfield. Moe tells Homer and the other regulars that one of them has to be the designated driver for the night. Barney Gumble loses the choosing draw and is appointed driver. Barney drives the rest of the men home in Homer's car. Homer, in his drunk state, tells Barney to keep the car for the night and bring it back in the morning. The morning comes. Barney does not return. 2 months pass. Barney shows up again at Moe's Tavern with no memory of where he left the vehicle. A letter arrives at the Simpson home. The letter is from the city of New York. It informs the family that Homer's car has been parked illegally in the Tobin Plaza for over 2 months and that it will be destroyed if not retrieved within 72 hours. Homer protests the trip. He reveals that he has been to New York once before when he was 17 years old and that the trip was so terrible that he has hated the city ever since. The flashback that follows is one of the more frantic, exaggerated portraits of pre-Giuliani Manhattan ever animated. Homer is robbed. He is yelled at. He is humiliated. He vows never to return. Marge and the kids convince him to make the trip anyway, just long enough to retrieve the car. The family flies to Manhattan. They split up at the bus station. Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie head off to enjoy the city. They visit the Statue of Liberty. They go to a Broadway musical called Kickin' It, a parody of a celebrity rehab story arc loosely modeled on the public collapses of figures like Robert Downey Jr. They eat from a hot dog stand. They have a wonderful day. Homer goes alone to the Tobin Plaza. There he discovers his car covered in parking tickets and disabled with a wheel clamp. What follows is one of the longest sustained physical comedy sequences in the show's entire run. Homer is told he must wait beside the car for an officer named Steve Grabowski, who will arrive between the hours of 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon to remove the clamp. Homer waits. He drinks an enormous amount of crab juice from a nearby food vendor. He needs to relieve himself. He cannot leave the car for fear of missing Officer Grabowski. He tries to go in a mailbox. He fails. Eventually, he runs into the South Tower, takes the elevator to the observation deck, and discovers that the men's restroom is out of order. He sprints across the plaza to the North Tower, takes its elevator to the top, and finally relieves himself in the urinal there. While he is up there, looking out at the city through the observation windows, he sees Officer Grabowski arrive at his car far below. Grabowski writes him an additional ticket for failing to wait by the vehicle. Homer's frustrated yell of "Doh!" echoes across the entire skyline of Manhattan and is heard by Marge and the kids on the observation deck of the Empire State Building. Inside the towers, the episode places one specific exchange that would later become one of the most cited details in the entire controversy. 2 men shout at each other across the open space between Tower 1 and Tower 2. The man in Tower 2 yells across the gap that the building authorities stick all the jerks in Tower 1. The line is delivered as a quick offhand joke. It goes by in seconds. The audience laughs and the episode moves on. Bill Oakley, in retrospect, has called the line regrettable. At the time of the original broadcast, in 1997, it was simply a joke about office building rivalry. The episode also contains a single visual that would later become the centerpiece of an entire conspiracy theory. At one moment, Lisa is shown holding a brochure for a bus tour of New York City. The brochure is advertising a bus fare of $9. Behind the printed number 9 on the brochure, the silhouette of the Twin Towers rises up. The two tall lines of the buildings placed directly behind the curve of the 9 form an image that, when read at a glance, resembles the digits 9 and 11. The artist who designed the brochure inside the episode was simply trying to make a clean visual that referenced the city. Bill Oakley signed off on the design. Nobody on the staff thought twice about it. There was no reason to think twice about it. The number 9 had been picked because $9 was a comically cheap fare for a bus tour. The silhouette of the city had been picked because it was the most iconic skyline in the country. The combination was meant to be a quick visual gag, nothing more. The rest of the plot involves Homer pulling a series of increasingly desperate stunts to free his car. He uses a road construction crew's jackhammer to break the wheel clamp off. He damages the front fender of the car in the process. He drives across the city while still partially clamped. He reunites with his family at Central Park. They drive back to Springfield together. Homer vows never to return to the city. The episode ends on a quiet domestic moment. The flashback that opened the episode has now been bookended by an actual modern visit. The story is complete. The episode was beloved at the time of its airing. Critics gave it strong reviews. Fan polls placed it among the better episodes of the 9th season. The musical sequence within the episode, in which Bart wanders into the Mad Magazine offices and Marge attends the Broadway show Kickin' It, included an original song called You're Checkin' In. That song would go on to win a Primetime Emmy Award in the category of Outstanding Original Music and Lyrics. The episode was considered in its day an unusually polished installment of a show that was already at the top of its game. For 4 years, the episode aired in syndication without any controversy. It appeared on local Fox affiliates around the country. It appeared on cable repeats. It appeared in international broadcasts. Then came the morning of September 11th, 2001. The two buildings that had served as the comedic backdrop for an entire half hour of television were destroyed in the largest terrorist attack on American soil in history. Within hours of the attack, the cultural status of any media that prominently featured the Twin Towers shifted permanently. Films were re-edited to remove shots of the buildings. Television shows pulled episodes that referenced the towers. The Spider-Man film that was in production at the time famously had to remove an entire teaser trailer that featured a helicopter trapped in a web strung between the two towers. The Simpsons made a quiet decision. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was pulled from syndication in many regions. Local stations stopped airing it. The British Broadcasting Corporation, which had only just acquired the rights to the 9th season at the time of the attacks, never aired it on BBC Two at all. It was the only episode of the season the broadcaster never showed. Sky One, the British satellite channel, eventually returned the episode to its rotation in heavily edited form, with all references to the World Trade Center cut out. Channel 4 also aired a censored version with the line about the jerks in Tower 1 removed. American syndication networks did the same. Some networks cut the exterior shots of the towers. Others cut the exchange between the two men. Others cut both. Across multiple regions, the episodes shrank in length, sometimes by several minutes, depending on which version a viewer happened to catch. The full, uncut version remained available on the complete 9th season DVD release. Some Australian and Canadian channels continued to broadcast the uncut version. Channel 11 in Australia aired the original cut as late as 2017. The Canadian broadcasters, Global, Omni 2, and the CBC, kept the original version in their rotations as well. But on most American screens, on most Sunday afternoon syndication runs, the episode either did not air or aired with the towers removed. By the year 2006, the episode began returning to American syndication in its edited form. The wait time had been roughly 5 years. The conspiracy theory about the brochure surfaced almost immediately after the attacks. People who had watched the episode pointed to the brochure with the $9 bus fare and the silhouette of the towers and claimed it was a hidden prediction. Bill Oakley addressed the claim directly years later on social media. He explained the design process plainly. He noted that the number 9 had been chosen as a comically cheap fare. He noted that the silhouette of the city had been chosen because the artist needed an iconic image to fill the negative space. He acknowledged the eerie nature of the coincidence. He pointed out that the episode in question was the only episode of any television series ever to contain an entire act devoted to comedy set inside the Twin Towers. There was no prediction. There was simply a long episode about a car parked at a building that no longer existed. In 2019, the show made one final gesture. A hand-drawn animation cell from the original episode, depicting the 2 towers in the background of a key scene, was donated to the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in Lower Manhattan. The curator at the museum described the donation in interviews as a hilarious and tender contribution to the institution's archives. The cell was preserved and added to the collection. The episode that had been quietly removed from syndication, edited beyond recognition in some markets, and used as the basis for a long-running conspiracy theory, had ended up, in one small way, as part of the official memorial to the very event that had altered its broadcast life forever. The episode had become a small piece of how the country remembered the towers, even if the official network broadcasts had spent years trying to remove the towers from it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the New York episode is the story of an episode that nobody objected to until the world around it changed. The next story is the opposite. It is the story of an episode that the network itself tried to kill before a single frame of it ever reached the air. The censors at Fox returned a script with an objection on almost every single line. The very subject of the episode they wrote was unacceptable for broadcast. The episode survived because of a single staffing change inside the network at exactly the right moment. And 6 years later, it would be used as evidence inside a Russian courtroom in a serious effort to ban the show from a national broadcaster. Section 7. The Gay Episode. Fox Tried to Kill. The 8th season of The Simpsons was already a season people inside the show talked about with quiet pride. The writing room had hit a stride that few sitcoms ever reach. The episodes were longer in shape, more confident in their tone, more willing to slow down and let a scene breathe. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the 2 showrunners who had also written the Australian episode a season earlier, were now the people running the room. Around them sat a writing staff that included some of the sharpest comedy minds working in television at the time. One of them was a man named George Meyer, a writer whose contributions to the show have been called by other writers some of the best comedy writing of the entire era. Meyer had a habit of pitching strange, blunt ideas that other writers would build on. One day, in a writing meeting, Meyer pitched 2 simple words that would eventually grow into one of the most important episodes the show ever produced. He pitched the idea of an episode called Bart the Homo. The idea was not meant to be cruel. The idea was meant to be a vehicle for examining homophobia. Around the same time, Oakley and Weinstein had been planning a separate episode in which Lisa would discover the joys of campy old objects, vintage memorabilia, and the kind of nostalgic kitsch that lined the shelves of small antique stores across America. The 2 ideas, on the surface, had nothing to do with each other. The 2 showrunners began to combine them. They built a story in which the Simpson family would befriend a new character, the owner of a Springfield antique and memorabilia store, who would slowly turn out to be gay, and around whom the family's varying levels of acceptance would form the core of the episode. The episode would be called Homer's Phobia, a play on the word homophobia, with the title suggesting that the prejudice in the story was something inside Homer rather than something outside of him. The new character was named John. The writers wanted a guest star with the right voice, the right cultural weight, and the right history with the kind of camp aesthetic that the character's store would celebrate. They reached out to the filmmaker John Waters. Waters, by 1996, was already a legendary figure in American cinema. He was the director of films like Pink Flamingos, Hairspray, and Cry Baby. He was openly gay. He had spent his entire career making movies that pushed against the boundaries of what mainstream culture would allow. The writers asked him to voice the character. Waters accepted the offer immediately. He has said in interviews that the offer came in and he agreed without hesitation, joking that if the show was good enough for the actress Elizabeth Taylor, who had appeared in earlier episodes, then it was good enough for him. The visual design of the character was based heavily on John Waters himself. The animators sketched a tall, slim man with a thin mustache, neatly combed hair, and a friendly, slightly mischievous smile. They had to make one small adjustment. Waters in real life had a perfectly straight, thin mustache. The animators drew it that way at first. The team realized when they looked at the test footage that the straight mustache read as an animation error. It looked like a smudge or a mistake on the page. They curved the mustache slightly, just enough to make it read as a deliberate design choice. The character was complete. The script was written. The recording was done. The animation was sent off to South Korea for the labor-intensive work of producing the actual frames. And then the Fox censor read the script. The system at Fox in the 1990s for handling sensitive content was straightforward. The script of every episode was sent to the network's Standards and Practices Department before production. The censor would read the script. The censor would mark the lines and words that had to be changed or removed. The censor would fax the marked up script back to the show. The producers would make the changes or argue about specific points, and then production would move forward. For most episodes, the censor's notes ran a few lines long, a questionable word here, an adjusted joke there. The show would absorb the notes and move on. The system worked because most episodes did not push the boundary too hard. Homer's Phobia broke the system entirely. The script came back from the censor not with a few lines of notes, but with 2 full pages of objections. The objections covered almost every single line in the script that had anything to do with the gay subject matter at the heart of the story. The notes were not suggestions for edits. The notes called the entire premise of the episode into question. The final line written across the bottom of the second page was one of the most absolute statements ever issued by the network censorship office. It read that the entire subject and content of the episode was unacceptable for broadcast. The censors were not asking for changes. The censors were saying that the episode could not be aired at all. This was a difficult problem for the production team. Most episodes that received light censorship notes could be edited at the dialogue stage before the animation was finalized. The voice actors could record alternate takes. The production team could swap the words. But Homer's Phobia was already past that stage. The script had already been recorded. The animation was already in production overseas. The episode could not simply be retooled line by line. The entire episode would have to be either aired as written, restructured at enormous expense, or quietly killed and replaced with a different episode. The first option was forbidden by the network. The second option was prohibitively expensive. The third option would have buried what the writers privately believed was one of their best scripts in years. The team made a few small concessions before the larger fight began. The writers asked John Waters whether he believed the gay community would find the episode offensive. They wanted his honest read on the script. Waters told them that the only line in the entire script he had a real problem with was a single moment in which Homer used a harsh slur as an insult against the John character. Waters thought the word was too sharp. The writers agreed. They softened the word in the final cut. Beyond that, Waters said, he believed the episode was a positive piece of work. The decision to soften that one line was the only voluntary edit the show made. The standoff with the network continued. The Fox censor's office held firm. The producers held firm. The animation continued to come back from the South Korean studio, frame by frame, scene by scene. The episode was nearly complete, and then, before the final fight had been formally resolved, something changed at the network itself. There was a turnover at the top. The president of Fox at the time was fired. New leadership came in. The Standards and Practices Department was restaffed. The new censors picked up the file on Homer's phobia. They read the same script that the previous censors had refused to allow. They watched the animation that was now coming in from Korea. They sent back a single line of feedback to the producers. The line read that the episode was acceptable for broadcast. There were no notes. There were no objections. The episode that had been declared unacceptable in its entirety just months earlier was now greenlit without a single change. The episode aired on the Fox network on February 16, 1997. The plot followed Homer as he befriended John, a charming and witty antique store owner whose store happened to be filled with the kind of campy memorabilia Lisa had been looking for. The Simpson family loved John. Marge appreciated his compliments. Lisa and Bart loved his store. Homer enjoyed his company. Then Marge, in a private conversation, told Homer that John was gay. Homer's reaction was the heart of the episode. He panicked. He decided that John was a danger to Bart, who had been spending too much time around him. Bart had begun wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Bart had tried on a vintage wig. To Homer, these were warning signs. He decided that he would rescue Bart's masculinity by force. He took Bart on a tour of the most aggressively masculine places he could think of in Springfield. He took him to a steel mill. The steel mill turned out to double after working hours as a gay disco. He took him hunting. The hunting trip went badly. The hunters provoked a herd of reindeer. The reindeer attacked. Homer and Bart were rescued at the last moment by John, who had followed them into the woods, and who used a Japanese Santa Claus robot to scare the reindeer off. By the end of the episode, Homer had quietly accepted John, told Bart that he would love him no matter who Bart turned out to be, and learned that the things he had been afraid of had not been worth fearing. The final image of the episode was a dedication card that read, in plain text, "To all the steelworkers of America," with a follow-up encouragement to keep reaching for that rainbow. The reaction to the episode was almost the exact opposite of what the original Fox censor had predicted. The episode was praised by critics. It was praised by viewers. It was praised by John Waters himself, who said in interviews that comedy was the only real way to change anyone's opinion. He said that you had to make people laugh first before you could make them think. The episode won 4 awards. It won a Primetime Emmy in 1998 for Outstanding Animated Program in the category for programming of 1 hour or less. It won a GLAAD Media Award in the same year for Outstanding Television Individual Episode. It became one of the episodes most cited as a turning point in mainstream American media on the subject of gay characters. Before Homer's Phobia, the typical depiction of a gay character on primetime American television was a one-off appearance, a side joke, or a stereotype played for cheap laughs. Homer's Phobia had treated its gay character as the moral center of the story. It had mocked the homophobia rather than the man. It had made Homer the figure who needed to learn, and John the figure who had nothing to apologize for. The episode also had real consequences for the show going forward. The Simpsons began incorporating gay characters and gay stories into its run with much more confidence after Homer's Phobia. Marge's sister, Patty Bouvier, came out as a lesbian in a 2005 episode in season 16 called There's Something About Marrying. The character of Waylon Smithers, who had been written as silently in love with his boss Mr. Burns for years, finally came out openly in a 2016 episode called The Burns Cage, which featured guest appearances by openly gay actors including George Takei. Showrunner Al Jean has said in later interviews that he sees Lisa Simpson as possibly polyamorous, based on a future set episode in season 23 that depicted an adult Lisa with 2 female partners. None of these later moves would have happened in the same way without Homer's phobia. The episode opened a door that had been bolted shut. There is one more chapter to the story. In June of 2003, 6 years after the episode first aired, the episode was used as evidence in a Russian courtroom. A man named Igor Smikov filed a lawsuit against the Russian television channel Ren TV. Smikov argued in court that The Simpsons, along with Family Guy, were morally degenerate programs that promoted drug use, violence, and homosexuality. He argued that the channel should be barred from continuing to air the shows. As part of his evidence in court, Smikov submitted Homer's Phobia. He played the episode for the judge. He pointed to the gay character John as proof that the show was promoting homosexuality. He argued that Russian audiences should not be exposed to such content. The judge listened. The case was thrown out after a single day of proceedings. Ren TV continued to air the show. Smikov's effort failed. But the episode had now traveled across the world and ended up at the center of a serious attempt by a private citizen to remove it from a national broadcaster in a different country. The episode that had nearly been killed by an American censor was now being used by a Russian plaintiff in court as the centerpiece of an argument that it should be banned in Russia. The shape of the controversy had been turned inside out. The strangest legacy of Homer's phobia is the long shadow it cast over The Simpsons itself. The same show that had once produced one of the most progressive episodes in mainstream American television history would, decades later, find itself defending older characters, older stereotypes, and older jokes. The Apu controversy that opened this video came many years after Homer's Phobia. The same show that had been brave enough to tell a gay story in 1997 would later be slow to evolve on questions of race and representation. The two stories sit beside each other in the long history of the show, side by side, almost contradictory. The same writers who had pushed back hard enough to save Homer's Phobia from the network were not, decades later, the writers in the room. The institutional courage that had survived the censor's 2-page objection in 1996 had not stayed steady across the entire run. There has also been one negative thread in the modern reaction to Homer's Phobia, and it is worth noting honestly. In 2002, the British media writers Steve Williams and Ian Jones, in a piece for the website Off the Telly, called the episode one of the 5 worst episodes of the show. They wrote that the episode left a nasty taste in their mouths because Homer is, in their words, simply a horrible figure throughout the entire half hour. Their criticism was not about the gay subject matter. It was about the depiction of Homer himself, who they felt had crossed from comedic ignorance into actual cruelty. The Simpsons Archive, which collected reviews of every episode of the show, included one review of Homer's Phobia that was so harsh and that contained so much homophobic language directed at the episode itself that the archive maintainers ended up giving the episode a special grade of Z rather than the usual letter grade. The episode that had won awards, that had been called groundbreaking by GLAAD, that had survived the network's most absolute censor's note, had also been received in some corners with a level of hostility that the show itself had never quite seen before. It had become, in its own way, a test of who was willing to listen and who was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Homer's Phobia is the story of an episode that survived its own network. The next story is about a death inside the show itself. A regular character, beloved by viewers for over a decade, killed off in a single half hour for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the story. The reason was a pay dispute, a travel cost, a flight from one American city to another twice a week. The character died because the actress who played her had moved across the country, and the network would not pay enough money to bring her back into the studio. Section 8. The Death of Maude Flanders. The character of Ned Flanders had been a part of The Simpsons since the very first season. He was the cheerful, devoutly religious next-door neighbor. He smiled too much. He called everyone by an affectionate nickname. He spoke in a soft, almost sing-song voice that grated against the sarcastic edge of the rest of Springfield. He was, in the design of the show, the perfect counterweight to Homer. Where Homer was lazy, Ned was hardworking. Where Homer was angry, Ned was patient. Where Homer cut corners, Ned followed every rule. The two men lived next door to each other, and the dynamic between them powered countless episodes across the show's first decade. The Flanders family, as a unit, was an essential piece of the world of Springfield. In the design of that family, Ned's wife Maude was the quiet center. She was as devout as Ned, but in a more pointed way. She was less openly cheerful. She had a sharper sense of judgment about her neighbors. She was often paired in scenes with Helen Lovejoy, the wife of Reverend Lovejoy, and the two of them together formed Springfield's small chorus of religious moral panic. Maude and Helen would protest against the things in Springfield that the show wanted to mock. They would protest against the cartoon Itchy and Scratchy. They would protest against the latest sin to come down the pipeline. The protests were one of the running engines of Springfield humor, and inside the Flanders home, Maude was the steady, decent presence raising the two Flanders boys, Rod and Todd, alongside her husband. She was not the loudest character. She was not the most quoted character. She was, in the description used by her own voice actress later, one of the few genuinely vulnerable characters on the entire show. Marge Simpson and Lisa Simpson were two others. Outside that small group, almost every character on the show carried some kind of cynical edge. Maude did not. She was soft. The voice of Maude Flanders, from the very beginning of the show, was a woman named Maggie Roswell. Roswell was one of the show's most versatile background voice actresses. She did not just play Maude. She played Helen Lovejoy. She played Miss Hoover, Lisa's second-grade teacher. She played Luann Van Houten, Milhouse's mother. She had been doing the work since the show first launched in 1989. She was a consistent, professional, important member of the production. The lead voice cast, the 6 core actors who handled Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa, and dozens of other recurring characters, had been negotiating their salaries with the network across the years. By the early 1990s, they had successfully pushed their pay up several times. Roswell, as a recurring secondary actress, did not have the same leverage. She was paid less. She was treated contractually as a part of a separate tier of the show's voice work. Then, in the year 1994, Roswell made a major personal decision. She moved with her family from Los Angeles to Denver, Colorado. The move was for family reasons. Denver was where she wanted to live. The problem was that the show was recorded in Los Angeles. She was now living in a different state from her job. The recording schedule for The Simpsons required voice work twice a week. Roswell agreed to keep the job by flying into Los Angeles twice a week, every week, recording her lines, and flying back to Denver. She did this for years. The cost of the flights, however, kept climbing. The show paid her per episode, not per flight. The actual cost of getting from Denver to Los Angeles and back twice a week kept eating into her actual take-home income. By the time the 11th season of the show was being prepared, in the spring of 1999, Roswell had reached a decision. She could not keep doing this without a raise. She approached Fox. Her ask was reasonable. She had been earning approximately $2,000 per episode for her recurring work. She asked for an increase to $6,000 per episode. The increase would have allowed her to continue paying for the airfare and would have brought her closer in line with the kind of salary structure that other long-running secondary cast members at successful shows tended to receive. She also offered an alternative arrangement. She told the network that she would be willing to keep working for her existing rate if they let her record her lines from a studio in Denver and send the audio files to Los Angeles. Either solution, the raise or the remote recording, would have allowed her to continue. The network refused both. Fox countered her request with an offer of an additional $150 per episode. The math was straightforward. $150 extra did not come close to covering the airfare from Denver to Los Angeles. Roswell understood the offer for what it was. She turned it down. She quit the show. The decision left a problem. Roswell had been voicing 4 recurring characters on a hit show. The show could not just delete those characters. The producers brought in a replacement voice actress named Marcia Mitzman-Gavin. Gavin took over Roswell's roles starting at the beginning of the 11th season. She voiced Maude, Helen, Miss Hoover, and Luann. She did the work. The voices were not exactly the same as Roswell's, but they were close enough that most viewers did not immediately notice. The show went on. Inside the writing room, however, the production team had been having a separate conversation about what to do with the situation. The executive producer of the show at the time was a man named Mike Scully. Scully has talked openly in interviews about how the decision to permanently kill off Maude Flanders came together. The show was approaching the February sweeps period in the year 2000. Sweeps were the weeks of the year when networks paid extra attention to ratings, because the ratings during those weeks set advertising rates for the following months. Shows often did big, attention-grabbing episodes during sweeps. The Simpsons writers had been considering a story in which one of the regular characters of Springfield would die. They had not yet decided who. They had not committed to the idea. But the conversation was underway. When Roswell quit, the conversation tilted in one specific direction. Killing off a Roswell-voiced character would solve 2 problems at once. It would give the show a major sweeps event. It would also remove the awkward situation of having a replacement voice trying to imitate the original. Scully has said that the idea came together quickly inside the writing room. He has said the decision did not feel forced. He has said it was a chance for one of the show's regular characters, in this case Ned Flanders, to face a real challenge and grow in a new direction. The episode was written by Ian Maxtone Graham, the same writer who had pitched the New York City episode 3 seasons earlier. The director was Jim Reardon. The episode was called Alone Again, Natura Diddly. The title was a play on the song Alone Again Naturally by Gilbert O'Sullivan, with the word naturally swapped out for one of Ned Flanders' signature catchphrase fragments. The episode aired on the Fox network on February 13th, 2000. The plot was simple. The Simpsons and the Flanders families went together to a stock car race at the Springfield Speedway. They were sitting in the bleachers watching the cars go around the track. A group of cheerleaders below the bleachers were firing free t-shirts up into the crowd using small air cannons. A shirtless Homer, sitting next to Maude, leaned forward and waved his arms at the cheerleaders, urging them to send him a t-shirt. The cheerleaders obliged. They turned their cannons toward Homer and fired a salvo of shirts at him. At the very last second, Homer noticed a bobby pin lying on the bleacher floor. He bent down to pick it up. The wave of t-shirts that had been aimed at him sailed over his head. The shirts hit Maude Flanders, who had been sitting beside him, square in the chest. The force of the impact knocked her backward over the rear of the bleachers. She fell from the top row. She did not survive the fall. The character was dead. The Simpsons producers had decided not to reveal in advance which character would die. They wanted to create speculation. They wanted to build viewer interest. They asked Fox not to send out screener tapes to television critics, which was a standard practice the show had always done in earlier years. The network agreed. The press began to speculate. The title of the episode, Alone Again Natura Diddly, gave a major clue. The word diddly was Ned Flanders' signature speech tick. The Contra Costa Times printed an article on the morning of the broadcast suggesting that Ned's wife should watch her back. By the time the episode aired that night, many viewers already suspected what was coming. Roswell's earlier announced departure made it easier still to guess. The reveal landed, but the speculation had taken some of the wind out of it. The rest of the episode followed Ned Flanders as he tried to handle the loss. Homer attempted to console him. Homer realized, while talking with Ned, that his own actions had played a role in Maude's death. He had also parked illegally in the ambulance zone outside the speedway, which had prevented any emergency response from reaching Maude in time. The episode then turned to Homer trying to find Ned a new partner through a series of unsuccessful dates. Ned began to question his faith in God. His faith was eventually restored in the final scene, when he heard a Christian rock band singer, played by guest star Sean Colvin, sing in church. The episode tried hard to balance the death with humor. The reaction from fans was not warm. Many viewers found the death cynical. They could feel that the choice had been made for reasons outside the story. The death of a regular character was a sacred moment in television. Doing it as a sweep stunt, in part because of an unresolved pay dispute, did not sit right. The grim irony of the situation came 2 years later. In the year 2002, Maggie Roswell and Fox reached a new deal. The network agreed to let her record her lines from a studio in Denver. The arrangement she had originally offered them, the one they had refused in 1999, was now acceptable. Roswell returned to the show. She resumed voicing Helen Lovejoy. She resumed voicing Miss Hoover. She resumed voicing Luann Van Houten. The three of those characters returned to their original voice. But Maude, the character who had been killed off because of the original dispute, was permanently dead. There was no version of the show in which the character could be revived. The decision had been made. The character had been killed in front of millions of viewers. The death had happened on screen. There was no going back. Roswell did continue to voice Maude in a few small ways after returning. She voiced flashback versions of the character. She voiced ghost versions of the character. Maude appeared in dream sequences. She appeared in heaven sequences, sitting beside her replacement, Edna Krabappel, who had died years later from a real-life cause when the actress Marcia Wallace passed away. Maude even appeared in an episode called Manger Things, in a flashback story where she was pregnant with Todd. But she never came back as a full living character. The death held. The status quo of the show had been permanently changed for reasons that had nothing to do with story. When Roswell was asked by the Denver Post a few years later how she thought Ned was doing without Maude, her answer was thoughtful. She said he was doing okay. She added that Maude had been one of the few vulnerable characters on the show. She said that the writing staff had eventually realized that something was missing in the dynamic of Springfield without that vulnerable presence, which was why they kept finding ways to bring Maude back through flashbacks. The arc of vulnerability that the character had carried, Roswell suggested, had been lost when she died. The show had spent years quietly trying to reclaim it. The death of Maude Flanders is now widely cited as a turning point in the show's history. It is treated by many fans as the moment when nothing was sacred anymore. The early seasons of the show had killed off the occasional minor character, like the jazz musician Bleeding Gums Murphy, but had never killed a regular fixture of the family next door. Maude's death broke that boundary. Subsequent character deaths on the show, including the death of Edna Krabappel and the death of Mona Simpson, were generally handled with more emotional weight. Edna's death came as a tribute to Marcia Wallace after the actress passed away in real life. Mona's death was a meaningful end for the long-running, estranged mother arc of Homer Simpson. Maude's death, in contrast, has often been described as the only one of the three that felt mechanical. It happened because of a contract. It happened because of an airline. It happened because $150 per episode was less than the cost of a flight from Denver to Los Angeles and back, twice a week, every week, for the length of a television season. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Maude Flanders is the story of a character lost to a single contract negotiation. The next story covers 2 episodes that cross 2 very different lines. One was banned by an entire country for 6 years over a single visual element on a parody talk show. The other was an episode the show produced in its later years that was so brutal toward its own main character that it has been pulled from broadcast in some markets, hated by fans, and remembered as one of the darkest half hours in the show's entire history. Both episodes survived. Neither has been forgiven. Section 9. Cape Fear in Germany and the Boys of Bummer. The 5th season of The Simpsons is, in most fan rankings of the show's long history, the season that sits at the very top of the list. It is the season that gave the world episodes like Cape Fear, Homer Goes to College, Rosebud, Marge vs. the Monorail, Deep Space Homer, and Lisa vs. Malibu Stacy. The writers were hitting their stride in a way that has been described many times by people who have studied television comedy. Every episode built on the one before it. Every episode tried something new. The voice work was at its peak. The animation was at its peak. The willingness of the writers to take risks was at its peak. And in the 2nd episode of that season, the show produced one of the strangest, darkest, and funniest installments it would ever air. The episode was called Cape Fear. It was written by John Vitti. It was directed by Rich Moore. It first aired on the Fox network in the United States on October 7th, 1993. The premise was a parody of the 1991 Martin Scorsese film Cape Fear, which was itself a remake of an earlier 1962 film of the same title. The Scorsese film centered on a violent ex-convict named Max Cady, played by Robert De Niro, who stalks the family of the lawyer who failed to defend him properly years earlier. The Simpsons writers took the structure of that movie, lifted it almost frame for frame in some sequences, and dropped Sideshow Bob into the role of Max Cady. Sideshow Bob, voiced by the actor Kelsey Grammer, had been a recurring villain on the show for several seasons by that point. He had once been the smiling sidekick on the Krusty the Clown children's show. He had attempted to murder Bart Simpson on more than one occasion. He had been imprisoned. He was now, in the world of the show, applying for parole. The episode opens with Bart receiving a series of threatening letters in the mail. The letters are written in red ink that resembles blood. They threaten his life. Bart shows them to Marge. Marge is alarmed. The family soon learns that Sideshow Bob has been released from prison on parole, despite the obvious tattoo across his chest that reads, "Die, Bart, die." The parole board, in a moment of dark comic absurdity, accepts Sideshow Bob's explanation that the tattoo is in fact German for the phrase, "The, Bart, the." Bob argues to the board that no man capable of speaking German could ever do harm to anyone. The board releases him. The Simpson family, fearing for Bart's safety, signs up for the Witness Relocation Program. They move to a small town called Terror Lake. They take on a new family name. They are now the Thompsons. The middle of the episode is one long extended chase sequence. Sideshow Bob attaches himself to the underside of the family's station wagon and rides with them undetected on the long drive to Terror Lake. He is dragged across hot coffee that Homer spills out the window. He is run through a long stretch of cactus plants. He is finally thrown free of the car when the family arrives in their new town. He stumbles out from underneath the vehicle and steps on a garden rake. The rake handle flies up and hits him directly in the face. The animator's original plan was for that one rake gag to play once. The episode, however, came in shorter than expected. The director needed extra time to fill, so the team simply repeated the rake gag 8 more times. Sideshow Bob walked across 9 rakes in total, each one rising up and hitting him in the face with the same slow, exhausted groan. The repetition was a desperate animation fix. It turned out to be one of the most quoted pieces of physical comedy in the history of the show. Kelsey Grammer himself, who had recorded the moan only one time, had no idea the gag had been extended. He was reportedly surprised when he saw the final cut. The episode then escalates further. Bob sneaks aboard the family's houseboat in the night. He cuts the rope tying it to the dock, and the houseboat drifts off into a dark swamp. Bob ties up the entire family. He prepares to murder Bart. Bart, in a final moment of cleverness, asks Bob for one last request before he dies. He asks Bob to sing the entire score of the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta HMS Pinafore. Bob, who is a trained musical theater performer in addition to being a homicidal maniac, cannot resist the offer. He sings. He sings every song. By the time he finishes, the houseboat has drifted slowly all the way back to civilization, where Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police are waiting. Bob is arrested. Bart is saved. The episode ends. There is one specific scene inside Cape Fear that almost no American viewer remembers. It is a brief sequence in which Bart and Lisa are watching a parody late-night television show called Up Late with McBain. The host is Rainier Wolfcastle, the action movie star who voices the McBain character. The announcer of the show, the man whose job is to introduce the host at the start of the episode, is a tall, stern-faced character dressed in the formal uniform of an Obergruppenführer in the German Schutzstaffel. The Schutzstaffel is the formal name for the SS, the paramilitary organization of the Nazi Party that operated in Germany during the years of the Third Reich. The character on the show is wearing the full uniform. He has the cap, the high collar, and the swastika armband on his sleeve. The joke runs for only a few seconds. The American audience laughed, the show moved on, and the rest of the episode unfolded. In Germany, that scene was not a joke. The display of swastikas and other Nazi symbols is illegal under German law. The relevant section of the German Criminal Code is paragraph 86A, which prohibits the use of symbols of unconstitutional organizations. There are exceptions for educational, artistic, and historical purposes, but those exceptions are evaluated narrowly. A short comedic sequence on a foreign cartoon featuring a character in full SS regalia did not meet the standard. The episode was banned in Germany. It could not be aired on German television. It could not be shown on German cable. The ban held for 6 years. The episode was finally cleared for German broadcast in 1999. When it was eventually shown, the version that aired was edited. The opening of the episode, which contained the McBain announcer scene, was cut. The German broadcast began later in the episode, with Marge handing the kids their mail and Bart noticing the threatening letters. The McBain joke was simply removed. The full, uncut version of Cape Fear did eventually become available in Germany, on DVD and on streaming services in later years. The country's media landscape evolved over time. The episode, in its complete form, is now considered one of the great installments of the show by German fans, the same way it is considered one of the great installments by American fans. The 6-year delay is the only mark on its broadcast history in that country. Behind the scenes, however, the case stands as one of the clearest examples of the show running into a hard legal limit overseas. Most of the show's controversies abroad were political or cultural. The German ban on Cape Fear was simply a question of law. The episode was illegal to broadcast as written. The country waited until the legal climate shifted slightly. The episode then aired with the offending sequence removed. It is the only major Simpsons episode ever banned in a country for purely legal reasons relating to the depiction of a single uniform. The episode that is otherwise widely considered the best work the show ever produced remains, in the records of German broadcast history, an episode that the country waited 6 years to air. The other episode at the center of this section sits at the opposite end of the show's history, both in time and in critical reputation. By the year 2007, The Simpsons had been on the air for 18 years. The writing room had cycled through several generations of writers. The original Golden Era staff was long gone. The show was, by most measures, in a creative slump that fans would later describe as the long middle period. New episodes still aired every Sunday. New stories still got produced. But the sharpness of the early years had been replaced by something looser and stranger. The 18th season of the show, which aired across 2006 and 2007, was one of the seasons that fans would later point to as the moment when the show seemed to lose track of how cruelly it could treat its own main character. The episode that has come to define that moment, more than any other, is the 18th episode of that season. It was called The Boys of Bummer. It was written by Michael Price. It was the first episode ever directed by Rob Oliver. It first aired on April 29th, 2007. The episode is about Little League Baseball. Springfield's local Little League team, the Springfield Isototes, advances to the championship game against a rival team from the neighboring town of Shelbyville. Bart Simpson is on the Isototes. He plays the outfield. The team is leading. The game is almost over. A final fly ball is hit toward Bart's position. Bart positions himself underneath it. The ball is in the air. The crowd is watching. The catch is the catch that ends the game and wins the championship. The ball comes down. Bart misses it. The opposing team scores. The Isototes lose the championship. The episode could have ended there. It did not. What follows in the rest of the episode is a sustained 20-minute sequence in which the entire town of Springfield turns on Bart for the missed catch. Strangers in the street insult him. Children mock him. Adults shout at him. His friends abandon him. The gag of the episode is that Springfield has officially branded itself on a giant billboard at the edge of town as the meanest city in America. The billboard is meant to be ironic, the kind of self-deprecating joke that Springfield has worn for years. In this episode, the billboard becomes literal. The town really is the meanest city in America. The town really does dedicate its full collective attention to making a 10-year-old boy suffer for missing a single ball. Lisa, in a moment of compassion, tries to cheer her brother up. She takes him to a baseball memorabilia convention. There, she introduces him to a veteran player named Joe LaBute, an aging man whose own career had been defined by a single famous error in the 1943 World Series. The character is loosely based on the real Major League player Bill Buckner, whose mishandled ground ball in the 1986 World Series became one of the most replayed moments in baseball history and dogged him for decades after. LaBute tells Bart that he understands what Bart is going through. He tells Bart that one mistake does not have to define a person's entire life. He gives Bart a heartfelt speech about resilience. Bart begins to feel better. Then, LaBute asks the boy his name. Bart tells him. LaBute recognizes the name. He starts shouting at Bart. He calls Bart a disappointment to the entire town. He turns the room of fans against him. The one moment of comfort the episode gave Bart is taken away in the next breath. The episode then moves into its darkest stretch. Bart, broken by the sustained public abuse, snaps. He spends the night spray painting the words, "I hate Bart Simpson," across every visible surface in the town of Springfield. He paints the message on walls, on mailboxes, on cars. He even paints it on the body of a passed-out Barney Gumble. The next morning, Lisa wakes up to find the town covered in the message. She and Marge go searching for him. They find him at the top of the town's water tower. He is still painting the message there. He is at the top of the tower. He is holding onto a rope. The town has gathered below, looking up at him. Bart, in front of his mother and his sister and the assembled crowd, lets go of the rope. He falls. The episode shows the fall in full. Bart hits the ground. The crowd does not stop him from jumping. Several members of the crowd actively encourage the jump. Joe LaBute, watching from the scene, finally realizes what is happening and tries to catch Bart. He trips. He fails. Bart hits the ground hard. Grandpa Simpson stands over LaBute and tells him plainly that he is no good. The episode then has Dr. Hibbert revive Bart at the hospital. The doctor announces that Bart will pull through, but will need extended rest. Marge, finally pushed past her limit, walks outside the hospital and confronts the gathered crowd that is still chanting against her son. She tells them that they have nearly killed her 10-year-old child. She tells them that the experience will haunt him for the rest of his life. The crowd, finally shamed, agrees to restage the championship game and let Bart catch the ball. The episode ends with 78 failed attempts at the catch before Bart finally manages it. 60 years later, in a flashback flash-forward, an elderly Milhouse almost lets it slip to an elderly Bart that the entire restaging had been faked. The reception of the episode was disastrous. The official ratings on the night of broadcast were not unusual. The episode drew about 7.5 million viewers, which was within the normal range for the show in that era. But the reaction in the days, weeks, and years after the broadcast was overwhelmingly negative. Critics called the episode mean-spirited. Fans called it cruel. The website IGN gave it a rating of 4 out of 10, citing the unrelenting hostility toward Bart and the lack of redeeming humor. The IMDb user rating for the episode hovered for years around 5.9 out of 10, which placed it among the worst-rated episodes in the entire run. Many fans began citing it, in online discussions, as the single worst Simpsons episode they had ever seen. Multiple fan-made worst of lists ranked it at or near the top. The specific objection to the episode was almost always the same. The episode put Bart, a fictional 10-year-old child, through 22 minutes of public bullying so intense that it drove the character to attempt suicide. The episode did not handle that attempt with gravity. The crowd around Bart cheered the jump. Several minor characters, including Chief Wiggum, watched without making any attempt to intervene. The episode treated the suicide moment as a beat in a comedy plot rather than a moment of real weight. Many viewers found the depiction simply unwatchable. Some fans reported that the episode pushed them away from the show entirely, in some cases for years. The episode also became a frequent reference point in conversations about the difference between the show's earlier years, in which Bart had been a sympathetic figure even when the world was cruel to him, and the show's later years, in which the world's cruelty toward Bart sometimes seemed to be the entire point. There is a question, often asked online, about whether the episode was officially banned anywhere. The answer is mixed. There is no official record of a national broadcaster banning the episode the way Germany banned Cape Fear. There are sources, however, including various Simpsons fan wikis and discussion threads, that indicate that some networks chose not to rerun the episode in syndication, citing the suicide attempt sequence and the harsh treatment of bullying. Channel 4 in the United Kingdom and certain Fox-affiliated stations have been mentioned in fan discussions as having quietly stopped airing the episode. The exact list of broadcasters that have removed it from rotation is not fully documented in public records. What is documented is that the episode is not aired in syndication with anything close to the frequency of other episodes from the same era. It is generally skipped over in the casual rerun cycle, even when other unpopular episodes from the same season remain in regular rotation. The episode survived its initial broadcast. It has not survived in the same way that other episodes have. It sits instead in a kind of permanent shadow. The episode is also notable for its specific emotional structure. The B plot of the episode is almost completely tonally separate from the A plot. While Bart is being driven to a suicide attempt by the entire town, Homer is having a series of farcical adventures with mattress salesmen. The B plot involves Homer accidentally selling a mattress to himself, then to the Lovejoys, then trading it back, then sneaking into the Lovejoys' house to recover it. The two plots share screen time but never share emotional weight. The cheerful absurdity of the B plot, sitting next to the bleak severity of the A plot, has been described by many fans as the single weirdest tonal mismatch in the show's history. The contrast made the suicide attempt feel even more isolated. The episode treated Bart's near death as one event among many, rather than as the single dominant emotional beat of the half hour. The Boys of Bummer remains, almost 20 years after its broadcast, one of the episodes that fans cite when they explain why they stopped watching the show. It is also one of the episodes that fans cite when they argue that the show should have ended years before it actually did. The episode did not break a foreign legal code. It did not get banned by a state. It simply broke something inside the relationship between the show and its long-term audience. Cape Fear had been delayed in Germany for a single uniform. The Boys of Bummer was broadcast everywhere, on time, with no censorship at all. Many viewers wished afterward that someone had stopped it before it ever aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Cape Fear and the Boys of Bummer is the story of two episodes that cross two very different lines, one legal and one emotional. The next and final story is about an episode that reached out into reality itself, accidentally predicted the future of an entire country, and triggered a private war inside the writing room of the show. The prediction was about a future president of the United States. The Civil War was between the show's own creator, Matt Groening, and his own producing partner, James L. Brooks, over a crossover episode that Groening did not want to make. Section 10, The Trump Prediction and the Civil War Inside the Show. The 11th season of The Simpsons aired across the years 1999 and 2000. The show, by that point, had been on the air for over a decade. The 17th episode of that season was called Bart to the Future. It was written by a man named Dan Greaney, one of the show's longtime writers. The director was Michael Marcantel. The episode first aired on the Fox network in the United States on March 19, 2000. By the standards of the show, it was not a particularly notable episode at the time of its broadcast. About 8 million American viewers watched it. The reviews were mixed. Some fans liked the central premise. Others found it too dark for the character of Bart. The episode came and went. The show moved on to its next episode the following Sunday. There was no sign on the night the episode aired that this single half hour would later become one of the most cited pieces of Simpsons trivia in modern American culture. The premise of the episode was a flash forward into the future of the Simpson family. The setup involved Bart visiting an Indian-owned casino with his family. Inside the casino, the manager offered Bart a vision of his own future. The vision showed Bart as a 30-year-old wannabe rock musician, broke, sharing an apartment with a similarly grown-up Ralph Wiggum, scraping by on small gigs at a seafood restaurant owned by a future Nelson Muntz. The two of them performed for an audience that paid them not in money, but in popcorn shrimp. Bart, in this vision, was a man defined by entitlement. He blamed his failure on everyone else. He moved through his future life as the kind of man who believed he was always one big break away from the comfort he believed he was owed. Dan Greaney has said in interviews that the writing room recognized this character instantly because the writers knew people like Bart of the future from their own lives outside the show. The vision then turned to Lisa. In the vision, Lisa had grown up to become the President of the United States. She was the first openly heterosexual female president in American history, according to her own announcement on screen. She was working out of the Oval Office. She was wearing a purple suit with a small gold collar and a single round pearl-like jewel pinned at her chest. She was meeting with her staff to discuss the financial state of the country. The country was in a budget crisis. The crisis had not been her fault. It had been inherited from her predecessor. In a single throwaway line of dialogue, Lisa explained the crisis to her cabinet. She said that her administration had inherited quite a budget crunch from the previous president. The line continued. The previous president, Lisa said, had been Donald Trump. The line was, in 2000, a joke. Donald Trump at that point was a New York real estate developer with a famously aggressive personality and a long history of media appearances. He had recently completed a brief and unsuccessful campaign for the presidential nomination of the Reform Party, the same political party that had elected the wrestler Jesse Ventura as governor of Minnesota the year before. Trump's Reform Party run had ended in early 2000, just before the episode was written. He was, by any reasonable measure, a long shot for the actual American presidency. The writers used him in the same spirit that they used dozens of other public figures across the show's run. He was a recognizable name. He was a useful comedic shorthand. Greene has said in interviews since that the joke was meant as a kind of warning. He has said the line was pitched in the writing room as the logical last stop before America hit bottom. He has said the choice of Trump was meant to be consistent with the larger comic vision of America going slowly insane. The line was not meant as prophecy. It was meant as the punchline of an absurd flash forward. The episode aired and disappeared into the catalog of the show. For 16 years, it lived as a small piece of trivia. Then came the year 2016. Donald Trump entered the Republican primary race. He won the nomination. He defeated his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, on election night, November 8, 2016. He became the 45th President of the United States. And almost overnight, the old line from Bart to the Future began circulating online. Fans posted screenshots. Articles were written. The Hollywood Reporter tracked down Dan Greene, the writer of the original episode. Greene told the magazine that the line had always been intended as a warning. He said he was tickled that the old episode was getting all the new attention, but that he doubted the moment would lead to a full, critical reevaluation of the rest of the episode. He laughed about it. He said The Simpsons had always embraced the over-the-top side of American culture. He said Trump was simply the fulfillment of that. The show itself acknowledged the prediction directly 4 days after the election. In the chalkboard gag at the start of the episode that aired on November 13, 2016, called Havana Wild Weekend, Bart Simpson wrote the same sentence over and over on the chalkboard. The sentence read that being right was a terrible feeling. The line was a quiet acknowledgement from the writing room that the joke from 16 years earlier had landed in a way nobody had wanted. The show had predicted the presidency. The presidency had arrived. The writers were not celebrating. The Trump prediction has been studied since. Many other claimed Simpsons predictions have been examined, and most have been debunked or explained away as coincidence. Showrunner Al Jean has said in multiple interviews that the predictions are mostly educated guesses, combined with the simple statistical reality that the show has aired so many episodes that some lines were bound to land near future events. Bill Oakley, the former showrunner, has said the same. He has said that there are very few real predictions in the show's history, and that most of them are coincidence, created by the long run of the program and by the way history repeats itself. Dan Greene's Trump line is the rare example that almost everyone agrees was something more than coincidence. The line was specific. The choice of Trump was deliberate. The fact that it landed exactly was a strange and uncomfortable convergence between satire and reality. The other story in this final section sits inside the writing room of the show itself, several years before Bart to the Future was ever produced. It involves the rare moment when the show's own creator, Matt Groening, went to public war with his own producing partners over a single episode. The episode was called A Star is Burns. It was the 18th episode of the 6th season. It first aired on March 5th, 1995. The plot involved a Springfield film festival. Mr. Burns produced his own self-glorifying entry titled A Burns for All Seasons. Barney Gumble produced an introspective black and white short film about his own struggle with alcoholism called Pocahontas. The film festival needed a celebrity judge from outside Springfield to evaluate the entries. The producers brought in Jay Sherman, the main character from a different animated series called The Critic, voiced by the actor John Lovitz. The Critic had launched in 1994 as an animated comedy series produced by James L. Brooks, Al Jean, and Mike Reiss, three of the men who were also key producers on The Simpsons. The Critic followed the life of an unhappy, overweight film critic named Jay Sherman. The show had originally launched on the ABC network and had been canceled there. By 1995, it was preparing to relaunch on Fox, the same network that aired The Simpsons. Brooks and Jean and Reiss saw an opportunity. They could use a Simpsons episode as a kind of soft launch for the Fox version of The Critic. They could send Jay Sherman to Springfield. They could give him a role inside the world of The Simpsons. They could let the audience meet him in a setting they already loved. The hope was that some viewers would follow the character back to his own show. The crossover would help The Critic find its footing on its new network. Matt Groening did not want this to happen. Groening had created The Simpsons. He had drawn the original sketches of the family. He was credited at the start of every episode of the show. The Critic was not his show. He believed that bringing Jay Sherman into Springfield would damage the integrity of the universe he had built. He believed it would suggest, falsely, that the Critic existed in the same fictional world as The Simpsons. He believed it would tie his name to a project he had not created. He told the producers privately that he was opposed to the crossover. According to a 1995 article in the Los Angeles Times, Groening hoped, behind the scenes, that James L. Brooks would change his mind and quietly drop the crossover before it aired. Brooks did not change his mind. When Groening realized the crossover was going to air anyway, he took two unusual steps. The first was that he asked for his name to be removed from the credits of the episode. He was the show's creator. His name had appeared on every Simpsons episode for years. The Star is Burns episode aired with his name removed from the standard creator credit. The second step was that Groening went public. He gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times. In that interview, Groening said plainly that he did not want any credit or any blame for the Critic. He said the encroachment of another cartoon character into his world violated the universe of The Simpsons. He said the Critic had nothing to do with the world of The Simpsons. He said the crossover was an attempt to use The Simpsons as a commercial for a struggling other show. He used the public press to attack his own producing partners. He used his own voice on the record to undermine an episode that had been made by his own staff. The reaction inside the show was furious. James L. Brooks gave his own interview. Brooks acknowledged that Groening had every right to disagree with the episode. He acknowledged that Groening had every right to remove his own name from the credits. What Brooks objected to was the public airing of the dispute. He said he was furious that Groening had taken the conflict to executives at Fox. He said he was furious that Groening had taken the conflict to the press. The Simpsons writing staff, including Al Jean and Mike Reiss, both of whom were also working on The Critic at the same time, were reportedly disappointed in Groening's actions. The two shows were, in their view, friendly properties. The crossover was a small piece of professional cooperation. Groening's public attack on it had felt, to many of them, like an overreaction. The episode aired anyway. It performed well. It scored strongly with audiences and critics. The character of Jay Sherman was, for a single half hour, part of the world of Springfield. The episode is now generally remembered as a perfectly fine Simpsons installment. The critic, despite the crossover, did not survive long on Fox. It was canceled again after a single short season on the new network. The crossover did not save it. The character of Jay Sherman did not become a recurring figure on The Simpsons. The two universes drifted apart. The episode that had caused so much public conflict between the show's own creators became, in the long run, a relatively minor entry in the show's enormous catalog. Its main legacy was the conflict it caused, not the episode it produced. The strange ending of the story is that nobody now thinks of The Critic as a Matt Groening show. Almost no viewer associates Groening with that other animated series. The crossover, in retrospect, did not in fact damage Groening's brand the way he had feared it would. His name continued to appear on every other Simpsons episode that came after A Star Is Born's. The damage he had feared did not arrive. The fight he had fought in public with his own colleagues had been a fight over something that turned out not to matter very much. Some critics, looking back at the dispute years later, have suggested that Groening's reaction was about more than the episode itself. They have suggested it was about the question of who owned the world of Springfield. They have suggested it was about the deeper struggle between the show's creator and the show's executive producer over which one of them got to decide what counted as canon. James L. Brooks had pushed for the crossover. Brooks had won. Groening had been overruled. Groening had taken the fight to the press. Brooks had been furious. The episode had aired, the world had moved on, and the question of who really owned Springfield had been quietly settled in a way that nobody on either side had wanted to acknowledge out loud. The story of Bart to the Future and the story of A Star Is Born's are two sides of the same coin. One was an accident. The show pointed at the future and got it right. The other was a fight. The show argued with itself in public and could not work it out in private. Both of them came down to the same simple fact. The Simpsons was built to make fun of anything. That included the culture. That included the show itself. That included the producers. That included the creator. The price of being able to do that was high. Sometimes the show said something true before anyone wanted to hear it. Sometimes the show fought with itself out loud because the people in charge could not agree behind closed doors. The cartoon family kept sitting down for dinner. The cartoon town of Springfield kept making new episodes. The real world outside the show kept moving. The writers kept watching it. And once in a while, one of them wrote a single line of dialogue that landed 16 years later exactly where they had aimed it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.